Hi everyone. Sorry, we were just on silent while more people were coming into the room. My name's Jude Philp. I'm Senior Curator for the Macleay Collections in the Chowchak Wing Museum. And this is our first Macleay talk under the formal Chowchak Wing umbrella, so it's really exciting for us. Before we start formally, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their people of the past, of the present, and those who are emerging, who have given to this land such a presence and a substance that we should really learn from and spring off from in the work that we do, particularly in the museum. So my thanks to all of those people. Tonight we have Vanessa Finney, who is archivist and a lot of other things at the Australian Museum in sort of jobs that change and go. And she's also a PhD student here at History and Philosophy of Science, working on part of this history that you'll hear tonight about the beginnings of science in the colony of New South Wales as it then was. Vanessa is also part of a team of historians and archaeologists who are working on a project funded by the Australian Research Council about merchants and museums, which is all about how networks of transport, networks of personal connections, and other kinds of links between institutions really forge the ability for museums to be able to collect in the way that they did, and to the extent that they did in exotic material, even somewhere like Australia, which could furnish itself with horn sheep from Italy or a zebra from an African nation. So it is with great pleasure that I am sitting here with Vanessa tonight, and I think we will just get started in her talk, How to Build a Collection. How to Build a Collection. After the talk, there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions, but can we please all type questions into the chat bar, and then we'll just run through them as we go. Thanks very much. Thanks, Vanessa.
Okay, great.
If you want to start, I'll just. Sorry, I'm just getting the screen going. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jude. So, how to build a collection. In the 21st century, natural history museums are very much defined by their collections. One of the Australian Museum's proudest achievements is its vast collection, a phenomenal 21 million specimens and objects, and still growing. It's hard now to imagine what the museum would even be without this solid knowledge base and scientific materiality. Its collections give it substance far beyond its buildings, exhibitions, educational outreach and events. But when it began, almost 2 centuries ago, the Australian Museum did not have a collection, and it did not see collection building as important for at least the first 30 years of its existence. So today I'm going to talk about some of the early pathways from 0 to 21 million, and perhaps provide some reminders that collections are not always a central museum priority, and that in any case, museums are always more than their collections, that collections arrive at museums in complex ways, that statistics and collections are difficult companions, and that building a public natural history museum starts with competing aims. We might even open up questions about museums without collections. So, I'm down there. Here's the Australian Museum's first gallery on the left, and the museum in the 1860s on the right. You can just see the first building behind the tree on the left in the right-hand photo. So just a visual cue of how quickly the museum grew in its first decades on its College and William Street site, so that within 50 years, it was a well-established part of Sydney's civic fabric. But of course, I'm talking to you from the Chow Chak Wing Museum with its foundational Macleay collection of natural history specimens bequeathed to the university by the Macleay Museum in 1887. When he arrived in Australia in 1826, Alexander Macleay brought with him Europe's largest international insect collection, purchased, exchanged and commissioned from a network of English and international collectors. It was said to have numbered around 100,000 specimens. Macleay continued to grow the collection in Australia, both by local collecting and more international trading. He leveraged his position on top of the colonial bureaucracy, along with his scientific clout, his worldwide collecting networks, and by allowing access to his collections and the colony's largest scientific library. He remained the dominant force in Sydney's scientific circles for the next 2 decades. He was the main Sydney agent for the establishment of the Australian Museum in 1827. I'm going to talk mostly about the Australian Museum, but it's important to remember that the Macleay family's scientific influence and collecting activities dwarfed those of the Government Museum, initially called the Colonial Museum, well into the second half of the 19th century. By 1887, the Macleay collection probably amounted to around 318,000 specimens. So although the Australian Museum was the colony's first museum, it was certainly not the colony's first or largest collection. So one way to grow a collection is to use your individual and family inherited and earned wealth, local and international social connections and scientific clout gained through prominent roles in scientific societies and collecting networks. So this was the way the Macleays operated. Of course, it's not a route open to many people, and that passion for collecting could also lead to trouble. The lust for possession overcoming several notable collectors of Macleay's time and Macleay himself, who was almost bankrupted by his hobbies and the need to provide for his large family. His nephew, William John Macleay, was perhaps more successful, growing the family collection by judicious trading locally and across the globe. He mostly purchased his specimens using his local social networks, but he also organised his own field collecting, including the Shepherd expedition. The complexity of some of these commercial trading loops is illustrated by this parrot from P&G. Still part of the Macleay collection, it was sold through the Sydney merchant and importing company Mason Brothers in 1880. Mason Brothers specimens are found today in Paris, New York, London and Berlin, as well as in the Australian Museum and Macleay collections. Accounting for the growth of the collections of men like the various Macleays is much simpler, or rather singular, than for the public museum. The museum is necessarily bifurcated from its inception, both a government-initiated and funded organisation and a collection, with each of these having competing and changing agendas and aims over time. By the mid-19th century, museums had moved from the personal and private cabinets of collectors like Macleay into the public realm. The Australian Museum was one of the first wave of publicly funded, state-run museums established across the British imperial world. Making the museum public brings it into the realms of imperial and colonial politics and government administration regimes, the social life of the city, and both local and international scientific networks, all of which influence the work it does and the value and meaning of its collections. Despite recent international contention over definitions of the museum, there seems to be near universal agreement that a museum must have a collection. But this was not true for the first years of the museum in Sydney, which had no collection, no fixed premises, and only one staff member, a collector tasked with collecting specimens to send to English scientific naturalists, collectors, and museums. With no collection, little funding, no physical space to store or display collections, in its early years, the colonial museums seemed to hardly qualify as what we now think of as a museum at all. You can read the tension in its foundational documents, a series of letters sent between London and Sydney, negotiating the funding and mission of the museum. Of course, in this negotiation, London held the best cards, and Alexander Macleay's suggestions were almost all ignored by his imperial superiors. The first orders of museum business were different at each end of the deal. For London, it was the necessity to find a mechanism facilitating and smoothing the supply of specimens to influential and demanding British collectors. So they were very interested in the activity of collecting, if not in establishing a museum collection. For Sydney, the need, in Macleay's mind at least, was for a networking and knowledge sharing hub where the colony's meagre band of concerned scientific men could meet, share books and information, and view each other's collections. More like a scientific society than a museum. Remember that in 1827, when these letters were exchanged, Sydney's population was only 12,000, of whom half were convicts. The fact that the museum was established at all seems miraculous in this context, much more a tribute to Macleay's outsized influence in both places than any local interest in scientific natural history. Conditions for the museum to grow a collection did not align until the 1850s, by which time Sydney's population was over 50,000. The gold rush and self-government had happened and funding was at last secured to build the museum's first building and public gallery. There was now room for collection storage and display and a government mandate to educate and entertain the growing Sydney public. As the museum grew in size and civic presence, collections became a priority, with more and more gallery space to fill and a new quest for scientific credibility. Holdings began to grow in earnest from the 1860s. These are the galleries in the 1870s, so big, spacious, and crowded. And here is a graph of how the collection grew over the second half of the 19th century. This graph was produced using the data coming out of the Merchants and Museums project, which is mapping and cross-checking archival sources to get a better picture of collection growth and change over time. We have to use transactions at this point, since our quantity data still needs some work, but this at least is a measure of collection building activity over time, if not collection numbers. You can see that during Kreft's sometimes turbulent time at the museum, the number of transactions actually decreased, dipping to an all-time low in 1874 when the museum was in chaos. There's a peak in 1884 when Edward Ramsey accelerated collection acquisitions after the disaster of the Garden Palace fire, which had destroyed the museum's entire ethnographic collection. The drivers for this transaction growth and change were both personal, political, and scientific, and above all, economic. The museum's ambitions have always outstripped its budgets, and collecting was heavily budget dependent, both in time and materials and in purchasing power. With little money, the museum's curators always had to be creative in using the museum's intangible assets to trade their way to collection strength. These assets included government backing, visibility, publicity in a public face, scientific networks, and over time, increasing scientific credibility and authority. As the collection grew to be an asset in itself, it became a taxonomic library of Australian species for scientific loan and exchange. It's a bit like the paperclip challenge, in which a Canadian blogger called Carl McDonald bartered his way from a single red paperclip to a house in a series of 14 online trades over the course of a year. He swapped the paperclip for a pen, the pen for a hand-sculpted doorknob, and so on until he traded a role in the film Donna on Demand for a farmhouse in Saskatchewan. Of course, along the way, what he was really trading was not assets so much as viral scale publicity and his media profile and blog audience. In our case, over 150 years, Kreft and many others since have traded their way from the idea of the museum all the way to 21 million specimens. So why did priorities change and the collection begin to grow, and in what directions? In a natural history museum, there are three main drivers for collection building, and the emphasis obviously changes over time. Through the 19th century, there were also increasingly two sorts of collections within the museum, those for exhibition and display and research collections. Research and curatorial interests are the first driver. And since he was the only research scientist on staff for many years, Kreft's curatorial interests led collection strategies. For example, his interest in snakes is very clear in collection acquisition records for 1864, when he was writing his book, Snakes of Australia. Exhibition and display. With display spaces expanded, Kreft needed to fill his new galleries, and overfull was definitely the look. The third driver for acquisitions are encyclopedic and taxonomic aims, in which the collection needs representative specimens from certain geographical areas or animal types. This was Edward Ramsey's main driver. And of course, there was always opportunistic collecting and external events that overturn priorities. These one-off events provide some of the biggest blips in the graph, especially around international exhibitions. Crest's dismissal, the Garden Palace fire, and Ramsey's absence due to illness in 1890. This is a breakdown of the previous graph into transaction types, showing how the strategies changed over time. I just want to talk about sources a bit here, since it's actually really difficult to know a lot of things about the early collections. So for now, I'm working with activity rather than item numbers, since our quantity numbers are still too unreliable for a number of reasons. And the first is that registration practices were not really standardized until the late 19th century, so around 1885. It's also clear that a lot of unregistered material was held in the museum. Plus, there were variable and changing practices between accounting for every item and treating acquisitions as lots, which can cause huge variations in numbers that are reported. From the mid-1880s, there's much more reliable data as registration practices became more rigorous and standardized, but this is often at the price of a loss of complexity, narrative, and event histories. Precise information about specific locations or conditions of collection that didn't fit the restricted scientized fields of a collection register are now left out. Of course, a data-centric approach makes sense if your goal is taxonomic completeness for the collection. It doesn't make as much sense once your goal is individual specimen histories and detailed provenance information. One of the aims of the Merchants and Museums project is this painstaking reconnection of collection records with their associated archival records. For specimens with no provenance information, the project hopes to use analytic techniques to discover more about the chemical history of specimens as a route to bringing back more of their history and connecting specimens across collections. So if we understand why a museum needs or desires a collection, it becomes easier to think about the ways a particular museum might do this. There are four main ways to grow a museum natural history collection: collecting, purchase, donation, and exchange. Collecting gets the most attention from historians for its colourful, often monomaniacal characters and their adventures in field collecting in sometimes hostile or unknown environments. In recent years, field expeditions have also become a focus for studying the agency and foundational contribution of First Nation collectors and their collaborations with Western agents. Clearly visible in the field, this contribution is largely written out of the museum's historical records by the time the specimens are integrated into museum knowledge systems. Going back to field records can revive and recenter this story and its larger erasure of the other ways of knowing and living with nature in Australia. Collecting activities were either by the museum's own collectors or a large range of collectors for profit and pleasure. Here, for example, is the museum's camp at Wellington Caves in 1869, where Kreft collected an enormous number of fossils, megafauna fossils. Doing your own collecting has obvious advantages. Theoretically, you can target the animals you want for a basic outlay in staff time and costs. In this period, taxonomic coverage was the goal, not environmental survey, and it was the museum's practical craftsmen who were generally sent into the field, not those with scientific skills. Obviously, targeted collecting did not often eventuate in practice, since a range of field conditions and variables, as well as dumb luck, always played a part in expeditionary success or failure. The phenomenal success of the Australian Museum's staff field collector, George Masters, who travelled across Australia in the 6 years from 1864 to 1870 and added almost 20,000 specimens to the museum's collections, is a tribute to the potential of targeted field collecting. the disastrous ventures of Richard Holmes, who shot himself and died in the field collecting bird specimens in 1829, and the crazy, wildly unsuccessful venture of curator William Wall to the Murrumbidgee in 1844, are witnesses to the need for skill, equipment, organisation, and proper funding for field expeditions. Purchase. In the 19th century, this was fueled by a growing sophistication in the market for natural history and new commercial trading houses, as well as one-to-one trades between collectors and museums. Most of Alexander Macleigh's collection, for example, was acquired through purchase at London auctions. His nephew, William John, relied more on one-to-one trades. For the Australian Museum, chronically short of funds, purchase was reserved for rare and special specimens, often those that would be featured on display. It's important to note here too that purchases of books kept pace with or outpaced specimen purchases through most of the century. For a beginner museum, far from imperial centres of knowledge and trying to build its own scientific credentials, having its own reference library was as important as a specimen collection and had mostly to be acquired through expensive purchases from London booksellers. In the Australian Museum's annual reports, the purchase of library books is noted in as much detail as specimen acquisitions. Every year, there are extensive lists of the library's new books and journal issues. Again, this emphasis on books goes to the museum's view of itself. A specimen collection without a library to classify, explain, and contextualize it cannot become scientifically useful and productive. So this is that graph again. Donations. You can see that right through the 19th century, donations were far and away the most common collection acquisition type, with hundreds of donations, often in very small lots every year. Donations are in effect a sort of exchange, where the value exchange resides in social connection and intangible reciprocities. All donations were publicly acknowledged in long lists published in the Sydney Morning Herald. There's everything from the strange to the truly bizarre in these lists. Donations are a continuing puzzle to me. The numbers far, far outstrip the registered collections growth, indicating that there was either a significant amount of wastage in these collections or that they were kept as duplicates or for exchanges, but not registered into the collections. But there are still two questions for me. It's not yet clear to me where these rejected small lots ended up. They were certainly not all used as exchange material. Were they discreetly disposed of? Did the curators, staff and trustees take them for their private collections or sale? Were they kept as unregistered duplicates or perhaps as specimen lots rather than single items? It's probably impossible to know this, but the trustees look very suspicious, since several had their own large private collections and were active collectors as well as donors to the museum. Conflicts of interest were everywhere. And secondly, why did the museum continue to accept such high numbers of small lot donations for so long, since this practice continued well into the 1890s? It's understandable that in the first decades, there was a need to build the collection and small donations helped with this. But over time, the balance between building and trading the museum's social capital by accepting donations and publishing named lists of donors in the Herald surely tipped. You can see this declining utility over Kreft's regime, with donations falling steeply over the decade. Just processing these donations into the Herald lists would have been a laborious and time-consuming task. Never mind the associated tasks of preservation, labelling and storage. The questions around donations really go to the heart of the practice of building a collection at the museum and the extraordinary amounts of effort and time that were expended on what seems at a practical level to be a relatively low value, low return activity. This shows the proportion of acquisitions by type, and you might be surprised to see just how much donations outstripped all other categories, 81%. But again, this is transactions and not actual items. Possibly the very small proportion that comes from the museum's own field collecting is inaccurate and probably underestimated on this count. Exchange. Exchange is the last of the collection building mechanisms. And here you can see a list of items exchanged in and out to the Otago Museum in June 1878. More like barter, in an exchange transaction, two parties, usually two museums, but sometimes an individual in the museum, agree on exchanging sets of specimens, setting the value by mutual agreement. To achieve satisfactory outcomes from exchange, patience was required, as negotiations could be lengthy, and it could be several years before specimens were actually received. In order to function smoothly, exchange relationships required the development of knowledge, trust, and social capital. Information asymmetries and logistical problems could always derail these transactions. It's a more complex relational activity than the other collection building avenues, but potential also very rewarding, with gains not just in museum specimens and objects, but just as importantly in personal and institutional network establishment and maintenance. Exchanges were as much social activities as they were scientific. Exchanges are not as common as the other transactional forms, but the quantities and qualities involved make them some of the museum's most significant transactions. At their largest, thousands of locally common specimens could be exchanged in a single deal. These were also sometimes the highest quality specimens money couldn't buy. Very rare and special Australian animals could be exchanged with selected partners for species from around the world. This is Australian lungfish discovered by Gerard Kreft in 1870. For example, in 1870, Kreft was very careful in measuring the exchange value of the newly discovered Australian lungfish, sending the first 19 specimens collected by masters only to his closest contacts, to scientific luminaries and to museums that he wanted to establish or maintain exchange relationships with, including American scientific star Louis Agassiz at the Museum for Comparative Zoology in Harvard. There were specimens for both Richard Owen and Albert Gunther at the British Museum, and frequent exchange partners Professor Giglioli in Florence and Julius van Haast at the Canterbury Museum in New Zealand. Over time, the fish lost some of its novelty and therefore exchange potential, but Kreft certainly knew how to make the most of its scientific value, as he attempted to both restrict the flow of specimens from Queensland and make sure that the Australian Museum became the main specimen broker in the first round of the lungfish trade. In the last part of this talk, I want to talk about exchange transactions in a bit more detail, using the very different approaches of curators Gerard Kreft and Edward Ramsey to illustrate a change in thinking about collections that's still relevant, I think, today. Here they are, Kreft on the left with some snakes and Ramsey on the right. German-born Gerard Kreft arrived at the Sydney Museum in 1860 from Melbourne, aged 30. His background was clerical and gold mining, and he was a self-taught naturalist, starting with natural history illustration, but also with extensive fieldwork experience in Victoria. He'd only been at the museum for a year when he was put in charge after the death of Simon Pittard, and he was appointed curator in 1864. He worked at the museum with a minimal staff of 5 or 6 practical men and 1 woman for taxidermy, photography, carpentry, delivery, security, and cleaning until 1874. Always unpopular with Macleay, he was dismissed from his position after a dispute with the museum's trustees. His initial special interests were reptiles, but he was a keen collector of all kinds, and he was a prolific publisher on all aspects of Australian natural history. During his era, the museum's gallery spaces tripled in size. He was followed as curator by Edward Ramsey, young, Australian-born and well-connected in Sydney's small circles of science. He was a favourite of the Macleay family and had been passionately interested in natural history since childhood. Ramsey had attended Sydney University and worked briefly in the family plant nursery and sugar businesses. His special interest was birds, but he also published widely. He was a member of numerous scientific societies in Sydney, including the Entomological Society, the Royal Society of New South Wales, as well as the Zoological Society in London and the Linnean Society. He was director during the Sydney International Exhibition of 1879 and also represented Australia at the International Fisheries Exhibition in London in 1883. During Ramsey's tenure, museum staff quadrupled in size and he recruited the first trained scientific staff and employed the first cataloguers. In 1892, the museum had 8 scientific staff and a total staff of 23. Even from a short and selective description like this, you can imagine that these very different men would have had quite different individual approaches to museum work and the social intricacies of exchange. Obviously, they also brought themselves to the task at quite different times in Australian and museum history. This graph shows just exchange transactions over time. So exchange out in red and exchange in blue. Crest's challenge was obviously mammoth. The museum was open to the public, but its displays were already overcrowded and disorganised. Pittard, who was the first trained scientist to work at the museum, had died after only 1 year. Kreft was certainly capable, but this was a huge task. His own ambitions were scientific, but he was largely self-taught and somewhat idiosyncratic. He had a healthy contempt for collecting for collection's sake, calling this about as good a vehicle to education and perhaps less than the dressed windows of any large grocery establishment. He could also be a little tactless. For local research projects like the specimens and live snake collection he kept in the museum basement in the 1860s, he received hundreds of single item local donations from local collectors of all sorts, from the governor down, all duly thanked as part of the gift making process in the columns of the Herald. Kreft rarely exchanged locally. The collection was simply not large or established enough to allow this. For Kreft, exchange was another research activity, and he was selective in his relationships. Since he had few Australian scientific peers or contacts and was not part of the English-speaking establishment in Sydney, although his English skills actually appear to be near perfect. For exchanges, he relied on his old world European contacts, and particularly German-speaking networks, both in Germany and at the British Museum. The blip in 1870s is due to lungfish-related exchanges and also to the duplicates traded from Master's very productive collecting trips. You can see too that exchanges out, in red, almost always outstrip exchanges in. Mostly, of course, the museum was trading from a position of relative weakness due to its distance, size, and limited reputation. It's a very slow process to build the scientific and social capital for a more equal trading relationship. Ramsey took over in 1875 and was soon exchanging frequently and in large lots. His activity dwarfed Crest's with 944 transactions over 17 years. So that's something like an average of 67 per year. Not only that, but Ramsey and his scientific staff exchanged with over 150 different traders, institutions, individuals, and commercial traders. The geographic spread was expansive too, much less focused on Europe, with around 50% of his trades done within Australia, and including the UK, the USA, Canada, Japan, China, South Africa, South America, and all across the Pacific. His largest trades were thousands of items, with museums in Europe and India, but most local exchanges were small lots by personal relationships. Ramsey had larger, more dispersed networks in Kreft and exchanged across all museum collections. Of course, this is in the context of much increased budgets for staff, storage and equipment, and the exchange opportunities offered by international exhibitions in particular. Apart from the difference in quantity, there's a qualitative difference here too. Ramsey's quest was encyclopedic. Crest was led more by his own curatorial interests. Buried in their exchange relationships are two very different views of the museum specimens. Crest's view of them as primarily a knowledge and research base, and Ramsey's as more of an organisational, logistical and collection management challenge. Within that too is a very different view of the museum. So, probably unsurprisingly, the answer to the question, how do you build a collection is, it depends. It depends on what sort of collection you want and how you plan to use it. It depends on what resources you can bring to the trade. Money is certainly nice, but not necessarily sufficient. The quickest way is to accept donations. The way to a high quality targeted collection is probably through a combination of do-it-yourself collecting, purchase and exchange. The mechanisms are much simpler to describe and enumerate than the question of what is the role of a public natural history museum. For Macleay, it was a network without a collection. For Kreft, a research collection with a public education side hustle. For Ramsey, a governmental institution and a bureaucracy. It's a shapeshifter, and its collections change in shape and meaning too. It's all of a political expression, a specimen and object collection, buildings and galleries, sets of relationships, practical skill sets, and a place for knowledge making and social exchange. It's certainly not just a collection. Before I finish, I just want to thank Henry Rees for doing the graphs for me. The Merchants and Museums project is creating data sets that are allowing this overview and pattern making thinking about museums collections. And the data sets that I'm using come from the amazing archives at the Australian Museum. But the work to make them legible and link them to specimens is all hand done, incredibly detailed, and I'm sure sometimes deeply boring. So special thanks to Henry, as well as Jared Hoare and Claire Wright, who have done this work over the past 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for an enormous tour through the 19th century and the different ways that people were engaging with their work, basically. Their work depended on animals, and how do you move them about and get them and do things with them, which is an incredible story. I would like to invite you all to put in questions that you might have from tonight's talk into the Q&A. You'll see a little icon at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them out and ask them. And as people are slowly putting in questions there, I had a question, Vanessa, about something the Macleays weren't involved in, which is the zoological gardens. Because at one time, Hyde Park had animals in it. And how did that relate to the acquisition that the museum had? I know some museums did rely on like London's Zoological Museum relied on the animals that were dying in London Zoological Gardens, for instance, to grow their collections.
Yeah, so there's two things. So Kreft himself kept live animals at the museum. So he didn't just keep snakes in the basement. He also had birds in the entranceway and animals within the domestic spaces of the museum. So he apparently had his own pet pig, and there were dogs and birds and all manner of animals within the museum. But in terms of the where those sorts of specimens come from, there are a lot of specimens that came from the Botanic Gardens, where they kept other animals in cages, and when they died, they came to the museum. And after that, of course, from Taronga Zoo as well. Yeah, so it's a big source of specimens. And I was recently in Berlin and working in the Natural History Museum there, and was like super surprised to find out that in fact for a museum like that, the biggest source of specimens is the Zoological Gardens.
Yeah, but it is remarkable how many animals are travelling to those zoos as live specimens on boats. It's quite an incredible trade.
Well, and how many die?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we
unsurprisingly,
So Julia Sacker has asked a question. Do you have a general idea how the value of Australian specimens increased or decreased over the 19th century?
I guess it depends who you're talking to. So I think the commercial trade exploded over the 19th century, and certain sorts of Australian animals were highly sought after. So that would also have crowded the museum out of that sort of market as well. In terms of the specimens that are held at the museum and getting a value for those, often we don't know because they don't have a money value attached to the records.
And Matt Hines asked, how important is collecting as an activity in museums now, especially in established ones like the Australian Museum with, as you've said, millions of animals and other objects?
The Australian Museum is still a very active collector, but I think in a much more targeted way. So both museum scientists, and of course we still exchange with other museums and other researchers internationally and domestically as well.
So I'll ask next from Chris Helgen, who's currently one of the research heads at the Australian Museum. Are there particular Australian Museum specimens that were traded to institutions abroad that you would especially love to trace and know more about, or that can tell us more about the Australian Museum's history?
Well, maybe Jude can answer that one, since she's looking at which specimens we're going to test.
In part, so this, what Vanessa's alluding to is part of the Merchants and Museums project, which is about collecting chemical data from specimens to see if we can see their origins between different museums. And one of those links Vanessa mentioned, which is Giglioli in Florence, he was incredibly amazing in terms of both record keeping. He was highly attuned to the needs of record keeping, and just really, really active exchanges. So the Australian Museum sent off all kinds of material, from once-off iconic Bougainvillean sculptures exchanged for sheep from Italy, to enormous sort of swathes of often ethnographic objects that he would then fill in with natural history specimens from Europe coming to the Australian Museum. And a particular interest in his era in the 70s in breeding, in kinds of breeds of sheep and other sorts of animals. So perhaps influenced by Darwin. Henry Rees has a question saying thank you very much. He also wanted to know about the move away from the small donations and how the practice diminished in the 1890s. Can you talk about why that might have been?
But I just actually, can I just go back to Chris's question as well? So I have a particular interest in the lungfish, which I mentioned in my talk. And I have been trying to, so I mentioned that there were 19 specimens in this first specimen lot, and it is incredibly difficult to trace the journeys of these specimens around the world, both because of the sorts of data that are kept now in collection databases and because people just don't know. So sometimes the specimens that you want, you just can't find. The question about donations after the 1890s. So my special interest is in Kreft and Ramsey, and after the 1890s, I don't really know, except that there was an economic crisis in New South Wales in the 1890s, but perhaps also so that the museum staff was reduced again, and perhaps that is the point where donations just became too labour intensive for less staff to process.
Yeah, or perhaps it was no longer so good to be united with the Australian Museum.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, in that, by the 1890s, you do have a number of competitors.
True.
In terms of the art gallery and other kinds of places where people were building social capital.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Not because of the wonderful nature of the Australian Museum at all. Could I also ask quickly about societies? To what extent does the Australian Museum stop being a place that has that kind of society discussion place that in part museums came out of, that people like Huxley really liked about museums. I mean, these events are society kinds of events that we're discussing things. Is there a difference between Kreft and Ramsey in terms of that public aspect of discussion?
Oh, certainly. I mean, Kreft for personality reasons and because of his German heritage, just didn't make the sorts of connections that Ramsey was born into. So Ramsey's way of working was through those societies. He was a member of everything, and that gave him an incredible network and access to people, collections, and the ability to get things done, and in particular to get more funding for the museum.
Yeah. How to build a collection.
Yes, yeah, it certainly helps.
Jane Brazier, who used to work at the Australian Museum, has a question and is now our curator of science, technology and historic photography. The Australian Museum in the first decades was not just about natural history, but also about historical relics, statues and art. Do you think it saw itself as being broader than only natural history for much of the 19th century, or how long did that last?
Well, I guess that it goes to that period that Jude was talking about, when the other institutions started springing up. So that's in the late 1870s and 1880s, where the art gallery was established, the technological museum was established, and there were other places that were hiving on parts of the museum's collection. But of course, to start with, the Australian Museum was everything. It collected everything to start with. Yeah.
So, are there any more questions that people have? We've got about 8 minutes left. And if there aren't, I will just give you some information about the new museum and the next chapter of Sydney City's landscape of natural history and art and social history things. So from the 18th of November, less than a month, you will be able to join us in person at the Chow Chuck Wing Museum at the Broadway entrance of the university. Over time, there'll be information on the website about how to book in, because of course we're in COVID time, so it's necessary that we limit the number of people into the building and just make sure that everybody's safe and socially distanced. But we would really love to see you again as an audience, because we haven't had an audience for some time, and to enjoy all of the challenges that you bring us as well. If you are too far away from Sydney to come in person, do log on to the website, log into Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and you'll find out things that are happening now, but also links to events like the one tonight, which will be a regular Thursday event every month or so. And in between that advertisement, there's another question which I'll ask from Katrina. How strong was the connection between museum donations, social notoriety and social standing between 1850 and 1890?
Well, I think that the fact that the donations were published in the Herald really speaks to the idea that donating to the museum was seen as a social good. And again, later in the century, with other avenues for building that sort of social capital, I think that probably dropped away. But I think that in the 1850s and 60s and well into the 1870s, it was a mark of your, social that it was a social good to be seen to be associated with the Australian Museum.
Is that also when the newspapers stopped publishing the lists of donations?
They stopped. They were still published in the annual reports right up into the end of the century, but they were only published in the paper up until I think into the 1870s.
Because that really gives you your wider notoriety. There you are in one of the few newspapers in Australia.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, we might end it there. Thanks again, Vanessa. I don't know whether you're able to unmute and go, but you can silently clap and say thank you. It's been really interesting. And yes, do log on and find out the next events as they're coming up, or come and see us after the 18th at the university. Thank you very much. Bye.